Welcome to Pretty Lies and Alibis. Let's seek the truth and travel the long road to justice together. What you know, Alibis. Welcome to a second episode of Pretty Lies and Alibis. I'm Gigi. Good to have you here. Big welcome to all of our new followers. We have a lot of new followers in the last couple of weeks, and I'm really grateful to have you here to be able to tell you what happens every day in this courtroom for those of you who can't watch. And so earlier today, I asked you guys to cross your fingers for my boy Mason. He never lets me post photos of him on the podcast stuff. He's just 15 and doesn't care for all that. But today, he did give me permission to post his picture. And so he got his driver's license on the first try. Super, super proud of my boy. He's 15 and he is a volunteer junior fireman that has over 2,000 hours at the fire stations here in town. And so I'm very proud of him. He makes being a mom very easy. For those of you who are new, I have 3 kids, 17-year-old daughter, 15-year-old Mason, and 11-year-old Sarah Rose, who is the life of the party. All right. Also, before we get started, a little humor, because today was sort of a rough day in that courtroom to me. But my 8-year-old nephew had his birthday party earlier this evening, so we went over and had burgers and cake. And this is their dog Pedro, who always stalks me when I have food, and he does this the entire time, y'all. I have not sped this up. I have not added any extra wiggle. That is literally how he stands the entire time I have food on my plate. So if you're new to the podcast, I'll put a link in the description and show you both of those. So that way you don't miss out on anything. Also, thanks to everybody who told me what Buckeyes were. In the South, we're pretty simple and we call them chocolate balls. They are my best holiday treat. I love them. My aunt, who is in the photo behind me, she passed away on Mother's Day this year. She was more like a sister. She was the famous chocolate ball maker in the family. I'm going to miss her so much this holiday season. I kind of dread it, but I'm also going to miss her yummy treats. All right. So, song fact of the day before we get started, in honor of Mason getting that driver's license, I Can't Drive 55 by Sammy Hagar. That song was written after he got a ticket for driving 62 miles an hour in a 55 zone in New York State. That 55 mile an hour speed limit was the highest permissible speed limit in the United States at the time due to the passing of the National Maximum Speed Law in 1974. So we've had a nice long talk about being responsible for yourself and other people who are driving, as well as that first speeding ticket, you're not driving, because I'm paying for 2 teenagers to have car insurance, and y'all know how that is. It is not cheap. All right. So y'all, I want to start by saying that I have nothing but the utmost respect for the prosecution team. They have dedicated 6 years of their lives to justice for the Rodens and Hannah Hazel Gilly. And I have seen over the years kind of the exhaustion that Prosecutor Canepa has. The last couple of days especially saw it. This is a big deal. This is kind of that cross-exam that you really have got to drive your case home and poke holes in the fact that he says he knew nothing about these murders. And George, it's been interesting the last few days to read the comments of people's perception of George on the stand. Some people just think he's lying through his teeth. Other people think that due to the fact that he didn't miss a beat and never faltered in his version of what happened or what he didn't do, that they actually find him very credible. And also that they're not sure now if they were on that jury, if they could find him guilty. I don't know what's going to happen in deliberations. It's going to be interesting. I'm curious. Will it take a long time? Will it be very quick? Will we get jury questions? Him taking the stand adds a whole new element. You have 12 people on that jury. All 12 have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he was lying through his teeth for 2 days solid. Will that happen? It's possible. It's also possible we get a hung jury. I just don't know. But really, with George taking the stand, and it was risky, it was a Hail Mary for the defense, and it could have went either way. Personally, I think it really Couldn't have gone any better for the defense, considering that George did not trip up and did not waver. Um, on the other hand, I think that the fact that he did not do that, it got to a point to where the prosecutor, I think, in trying to rattle George, got frustrated a little bit. I felt it about 2 hours in about an hour and a half into her cross exam was really when I kinda started noticing it. Um, After every answer that George would give, it got to a point where she would say, "Right." And look, I mean, she has poured over this case for years, and nobody knows this case better than her. I just think that this cross exam could have gone a lot better. But she kind of was in a catch-22, I think, as well, and that's important to remember. We've always heard that the case against George was the weakest against any of the Wagners, and we saw that yesterday and today, because now the jury is going to have to go back and deliberate, and really they have 2 choices. Do they trust Jake and Angela, who took a deal with the state, and you've got Jake, who seemed 0, 0 emotion, no remorse, and Angela pretty much the same way? Or do you believe George, who never lost his cool, never smiled inappropriately on the stand that I saw? He did smile a few times, but it wasn't anything having to do with the murders. So it's gonna be, interesting to watch these deliberations, y'all. But I do think that it was obvious towards the end that the prosecutor really kind of maybe was rattled herself, and that's unfortunate because this I think a lot rode on this cross exam. And I mean, Parker, defense attorney Parker, he finished it up strong. So let's go through it. I'm not saying either way. You'll never convince me that he was oblivious. These people did pretty much everything together. We all know. We've heard it for how many 40 something days now. But still, yeah, it's going to be interesting. All right. So the other thing too was she wanted to keep arguing with him about what he said at the border. And there were times where George conveniently had selective amnesia and couldn't remember what he said about this or that. It was never anything to do with the murders. It was always stuff that kind of surrounded the murders, but I mean, it's not anything that to me was like, wow, okay, yeah. Um, for me, I was like, just play the daggum tapes. I mean, they have to have either an audio or a video recording, and I can't for the life of me figure out at a trial for George Wagner why Angela Wagner's interview at the Montana border was the only interview played. I mean, it's a really simple fix, and you can hand him the transcript, but the jury can hear and see him and read his body language or read his tone. And I think that's much more powerful if you really are trying to drive home discrepancies in his testimony from that. Play the tape. I don't understand. If anybody knows that, like, they don't have that, let me know, but it seems to me they would have that, and I'm just curious why it wasn't played. So, she starts off asking if anyone ever asked him where the SKS was that he sold to his friend, and he said, "No, nobody ever asked." And she asked if he told them where it was, and he said, "No, because nobody asked him." So the answer is no. He did not know Jake had that specific 1911 Colt, the gun that he used in the murder. Um, she said, out of curiosity, why would he hide it? And she points out, you all kept your guns in the safe. And George said, to be honest, half the guns, like on the list that Jake made, he didn't even own them. It was a wish list, essentially. She says, for over a year, he owned a gun and you were oblivious to it. And George said he's owned plenty of guns that Jake knew nothing about. He did admit that Jake owned some 1911s. It was not OD green like the one used in the murder. Several of them, actually. And she says, "So you do know the guns he owns?" And George says, "I know some of the guns he owns." And she says, "Sure." So she says, "You're a hunting junkie. That's your favorite hobby." And George said, "It's my number one favorite." She said, "You hunted more than Jake?" And he said, 100 times more. And she brings up the fact that Jake, when he was on the stand, said that George was the one who did all the legwork into hunting season, such as the trail cams, doing the feedlots, studying migration patterns of the deer. George says he spent thousands of dollars on deer. And she says, "You sometimes hunted at night with Chris and Randa." George said it was mostly at night with them. And she asked if Jake went. And he said, doing the Winter Olympics, which is when they hunted at night and would blind the deer, maybe 3 times. So she said, when Billy would have you spot cameras as a kid, would he have you watch what you said in situations when you could have been listened to? And George said, my whole life. So he says he has hunted thousands of times at night. Chris Newcomb said that George was the best hunter he knew on the stand, by the way. George said he's really good as a diesel mechanic, worthless with a gas car. And he said ultimately he's a hunting and diesel junkie. Jake was not as good of a mechanic as he was, but Jake was very good at doing body work. So she said, you said Jake followed the rules, did his chores, played with his action figures as a boy. And George says, well, I wouldn't say boy. He played with them until he was in his teens. And George said he went hunting maybe 10% of the time with him, fishing 20 to 30%. And when he was younger and they went fishing, he would play with his action figures. And then when he was older, it became he would just lean over his phone the whole time. So you could just see that divide there between him and George, where George is just your outdoor country boy, hunt, fish, that kind of thing. And Jake was a little bit more, the opposite, I guess is the best way. George said it was more, or I'm sorry, Prosecutor Canepa said that Jake was a religious fanatic and he had a pesky habit of tattling. And George said it was more of Jake tattling on Chris Newcomb and him, and that Jake would tattle on them for things like driving the four-wheeler on the road or going on other people's farms. And if he put his four-wheeler on the road, Jake himself, he would tattle on George and Chris Newcomb, but never put his name into it, or he would say they made him go on the road, and then Angela would just believe him and not George. So he talks about this on the wiretaps where he says, you always get us in trouble with your honesty, and he should have gotten rid of the phone and smashed the laptop because, and the prosecutor said, you knew we would find a lot of evidence on there, right? And George said, my understanding was he said you guys were twisting the things you found on there to frame him. So again, it's just that wording of, he is just maintaining that Jake said you're trying to frame him. So he was very consistent with that all day yesterday and today. So she asks, was Angela a mother figure to your son? And he said, yeah, she was the only woman in the house. And he said that when he was home from work, he would spend the whole day with Vine. And then at night, he hunted with Chris Newcomb. And she asked, when did you sleep? And he said, maybe an hour each night, but it was pretty much like the amount of sleep he got when he was trucking. And he slept an hour on those times where he's supposed to sleep 8 hours, which she pointed out, you're breaking the law. So she points out you got upset when Sophie called Beth mommy, and George said he was forcing her to call Beth mommy. So she said, what you actually said to him is you have to tell Vine the cold, hard truth that Angela wasn't his mother. George said, I have to go explain to him why his mommy, Tabby, wasn't in his life. He knew she wasn't in his life. And George said he told Vine that his mom had some issues and that's why she couldn't be in his life. So the prosecutor said, why did you need to explain this to him again? And George said, because at this point, he was upset his mommy wasn't in his life. And Sophie was telling Vine that she had a new mommy and he didn't. So the prosecutor says, this whole thing, Sophie explained Angela was his grandma. And George said, I had to explain to him that, about Tabby not being in his life at that point. Then Angela refers to the call where George says Sophie can't keep her nose out of somebody's life. And Jake said she's 4 years old. You said she does anything deliberately to try and crush him. And then he says the B word got to ruin everything. And she points out, you referred to your 4-year-old niece as the B word. And George said, 5 to 6 days with no sleep, it makes you irritable. And he was upset that according to according to George, Sophie was nonstop telling Vine he had no mom and she did. So she says, "Do you remember calling Frederica a crazy W word? You called Randa a crazy crack W word." George said, "I've called her that more than once." Which, I mean, I shouldn't laugh because it's not funny. I don't like that word. It was just kind of the way he said it. It was just like, yeah, I did. He owned up to it. And so she said, "You told the border agents that Hannah Mae had turned into one herself." And George said, "That's what everybody was saying." And after she left Jake, she also points out, "You called Beth and Tabby the same thing." And he said, "Many a times." And so here's my thing, we can sit and do this, and it definitely reflects on him as a man to call pretty much every woman he knows that word at one point. But the thing is this, that's not what he's on trial for. It really doesn't have anything to do with the murders. And so for me, I say this every episode, I look at things like I'm a juror. I would be thinking, I mean, at this point, you're grasping at straws to make him look bad. Where is the big aha moment that should have come out in this cross exam about the murders? There's no doubt George speaks in derogatory ways about women, and women don't like that, but it's not a death penalty crime to do it either. I mean, he has no taste, no class, not a knight in shining armor for sure, but it was something that kind of I just sat there like, "What?" All right, so let's move on. She asked about scrapping with Chris Newcomb at night, and he said he never went at night. They always did that during the day. She asked about stealing converters, and you had to have a few at a time, and he said he had more than a few at a time. He said at one point, Chris Newcomb and his dad had hundreds stored up. Sometimes they would throw scrap metal in to the scrap cars to add weight when they were selling them to the scrap yards. And Chris and his dad got in trouble for not having titles, but they had a scrapper license. So they were allowed to do that. And he said the reason you didn't need a title to scrap a car, the reason they had that is you didn't need a title to take a car to the scrapyard. George said the ones he bought and scrapped had the titles come with them. So he had no need to get that license. And then she points out you have differences with Angela, but you have some strong areas you agree on, like you severely hate someone who hurts a child. And George said, yes. And she said, that's the same as your mother. And he said, I guess so. He said, she has paranoia. And so the prosecutor says, paranoia? She thought Sophie was being molested and that Beth Ann molested Sophia. Did you believe she did it? And George said, I believed it was possible. And instead of taking a chance, it was just easier to get Beth out of the house. And she said, you also believed Beth was going to kidnap your son and sell your kids into a cult. And George said, based on what she said previously about belonging to the cult, yes. The other thing, too, is we talked about this in an earlier episode. I don't remember if it was today or yesterday. Angela constantly told George and Jake they were going to be kidnapped as kids. It was like her fear. And so for me, I could kind of see where maybe he was a little sensitive to that. If something's pounded in your head, it's a little bit traumatic, even as an adult, I would imagine. But still, the chances of little Beth selling the kids into a cult, I think, are like zero. Poor Beth. She got the raw end of it for sure. So the prosecutor points out that Beth was in that cult when she was a child. And George said, I was told by her it was when she was a teenager. And so she points out, you thought Beth was getting up and unlocking the door in the middle of the night to allow people to come in and to hurt you and the kids. George said, I didn't believe she left it open to let people come in. He thought she wasn't locking the door. He said he was paranoid because his grandpa had his door kicked in and was robbed and hit over the head. So the prosecutor said not leaving that door open at night, getting up to unlock the door. And George said, yeah. So it kind of got confusing there. She points out, was your mother also worried about Beth molesting Vine and Sophia? And George said, yeah. So then she points out, you thought she was a BCI implant. And George said, actually, my lawyer was the one who suggested that. So then, how much did you pay your lawyer? George said, my grandma paid him. I'm not sure. She said, you said on the wiretaps you paid him $10,000 and he wasn't responding and you were going to knock down his door. George said when he moved to Alaska, he actually hired Clark separately from this case for Tabby. And the prosecutor said, and you gave him $10,000, you never filed anything. George said he was supposed to, but if you remember, that hearing was supposed to be 3 weeks after his arrest, that they had that court hearing, and he was supposed to represent me. I never made it, but I hired him for this case too. So she said, you and your mom believe that if you're molested as a kid and if you don't tell anyone or do anything, that puts any child you have at risk. And George said, I believe if you don't get them therapy to help them with their issues, it puts them at risk. I thought that was a good answer to that, actually, because it kind of strips away from that paranoia onto more of a, if you don't get people that have been victims help, it may put them at risk later of, he didn't say of what, but I would imagine just, sometimes just trauma. And, I don't want to say victim. I always say, survivor is a better word. People that deal with this are survivors, whether they survive barely or easily. They're survivors. So she points out, you didn't want Tabby's sisters around, and neither did Angela. And George said, I don't think my mom ever liked Tabby's family. So she said, you were looking at Tabby's Facebook in 2015. George said, when we split up, we were working on things, and she actually gave him the password to prove she was not sleeping with her best friend's dad. He said a couple of weeks later, he logged on, and under friends' suggestions was a picture of Tabby. And that account had one friend, which was her best friend's dad. That was the night he drove over to Tabby's in the middle of the night and said they were done for good. And that was it. He said that was the last time he went on her Facebook page. So the prosecutor said, when your mom said she took over for you, how did she get her password? And George says, I don't know. Prosecutor said, did she read your mind? And George said, I don't know how she got that password, but I can tell you how she got the other ones. And the prosecutor said, I'm only interested in Tabitha's password. And he said, she said she never gave it to you. And George said, she gave it to me when we split up. The prosecutors, and actually Tabitha did testify, I think, that she gave George the passwords to prove to him that she was being faithful. I don't know if that was after they split up or maybe during during the marriage before when all that came out. And man, poor Tabitha. Look, I'm just going to say it right now. These cases are not about Tabitha or Beth. It is unfortunate. I think that Tabitha's dirty laundry is aired, and it's part of the testimony. It's relevant to the whole story, but personal details and stuff. I just feel really, really bad that this is out there for Tabby. I don't know how she feels about it. It looked painful for her on the stand. I wanted to hop through my screen and give her a big hug, but I want to say that she is a very, very brave woman to me, and I look up to her a lot. And I hope she is happy, and I hope that her son is very happy too. I really do feel for her, Beth. All the people who were drug into this, Hannah Mae. I mean, all the Rodens, Hannah Hazel. There are a lot of victims in this case, and some of them are living, and so their reach was very far. So the prosecutor said, so you say she gave you her password even after you assaulted her. And George got very offended. And he said, I never assaulted her. She assaulted me that night. And Canepa kind of she says, okay. And then the prosecutor said, you said yesterday she got upset. And George says, with Vine. If you remember, he told the story. She was changing the diaper. Vine was screaming his head off. He goes in to see what was happening. She was kind of holding him down. He was kicking and screaming. So the prosecutor said, she bit you. And George said, I tried to give her a hug to calm her down like I have since we were kids, and she bit me. He said that she has bad bipolar episodes. So the prosecutor said, you left out when your mom threatened to get the gun. And George said, that was a whole other event. Would you like this explained? And the prosecutor said, no, not at this time. So the prosecutor said, what I want you to tell me is the night Tabby left, your mom said she was going to get her gun and threw a 2x4 at her. And George said, entirely different event. The prosecutor said, so your mom and Tabby both were wrong? And George said, yes. He seemed pretty adamant about that. I don't really know. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. So for me, when people thought Jake might have been lying about this or that when he was on the stand, or Angela was lying about this or that, it was always small things that in the grand scheme of what they admitted to me, didn't seem like anything you'd lie about. But um, the prosecutor asked if Tabby was afraid of the dark. And George said 50-50. He said someday she would say she was. And so the prosecutor said, "You agree she fled that night?" And George said she left that night. So she asked, "Did she come back?" And George says, "No, she came back to visit Vine." Prosecutor said, "Because that's the only place she could see him." And George said, "She came back many times to visit him, and we went to the movies and to dinner, just me and her, many times after that." The prosecutor said, "She gets on a bike and pedals to the gas station, and on the way, you and Jake pull up, and she says she's going to call her mom." George said, "She didn't tell me she was calling her mom. I kept trying to get her to come back in the car." And he's asked, "How did you do that?" He said, "I kept asking her to get in the car to come home, and we would talk about it." So she said, "You called the cops on her?" And George says, "Yeah, she was having one of her bigger freak out moments. And she had tried to kill herself many times." And Angela Canepa, I'm sorry, the prosecutor says she made it to a public place. And at that point, you called the police and made a complaint against her saying she assaulted you, not that she's tried to kill herself before. You said she assaulted me and you pressed charges. And George said, "I was asked if she assaulted me and I did not press charges. I wanted her to get help." The prosecutor said, "You didn't tell them she tried this before, and I want her to get help." And she also points out, "You took her to the courthouse to pay her fines." George said, "I don't know what the fines were for, but yes, I took her to the courthouse to pay some fines, and I was asked if I wanted to press charges, and I said no." So the prosecutor says, "You felt you needed to press charges because you were worried she would tell the cops what happened, that you assaulted her. Your mom threatened to pull a gun, and you were worried you would lose custody of Vine." And George said, "No." So she said, "You heard your mom and brother testify to the same thing." And George said, "They're lying to you like everyone else." So the prosecutor says, "Oh, like Tabby's lying, Chelsea's lying." And George said, "I didn't say Chelsea was lying. I said she was mistaken." The prosecutor said, "Right. Like everyone who talks about Frankie's lying." And I don't know where that came from. I thought it was a little bit of a bad judgment to pull Frankie into this. I don't really know where she was going with that, that Frankie's lying. I guess maybe she's talking about Frankie lying about. Guys, if y'all have an idea of what that meant, let me know. I'm still trying to figure it out. I don't know if it talking about their relationship as far as how close they were. I just don't know. I rewound it like 3 times. That's what she said. The prosecutor said, "Like, you haven't been able to tell us anything consistent with what you said at the border to get agent to agents. Everyone else is lying, though." George said, "I don't remember everything I said to the agents at the border." He said, "I'm not saying Tabby, Jake, and Angela are lying. I'm saying they're mistaking 2 events for one about threatening to get the gun." So Judge Deering says, "Would this be a good time for a break?" Because it was kind of getting, not heated, but at this point, I think he saw that maybe the prosecutor was getting a little bit flustered, and they took a break. So when they came back, "Do you remember buying a Keltec at the Westland Mall in 2015? George said, "I don't know where that's at, but I did buy a Keltec at a gun show." So she shows him an exhibit of the Keltec PMR he bought for Billy on January 31st of 2015. He used the Peterson Road address on that one, and Billy was with him that day. He said he wasn't sure if anybody else was there. So she hands him another exhibit of another gun receipt for Jake for the same date, January 31st, 2015, at the Westland Mall for a long gun rifle or shotgun. And she said, "You don't remember if Jake came?" And George said, "I don't particularly remember him being there that day, but I do remember my dad." So she hands him another exhibit for the same day, and it's a Walther Colt 1911. So she says, "You're all three at the same gun show. You don't remember that 1911 22?" And George said, "Never saw it." And he said, "I just don't remember him being there that day." He said, "I'm not saying he wasn't. I don't remember him being there." So she points out the drive from Columbus to Peterson is about an hour and a half. And so you've gone to gun shows with Jake and your dad. And George says, "I've been to gun shows with a lot of people." So she said, "You would have driven together?" And he said, "Maybe, maybe not." He said, "I just remember dad. We went for the gun we bought for him that day." And she said, "You don't remember the 1911 used to kill 5 people?" And he said, I've never seen it." She said, You said when you drink caffeine, you get to ranting. And George said drinking and taking caffeine. And she got confused and she said drinking alcohol. And he said, no, stackers or pills. Drinking means Red Bull or Monster energy drinks. And so the prosecutor said, do you recall making numerous threats of what you would do to Special Agent Scheider? And there's an objection and a sidebar. Deering says, if we need to look at something, we can. And the prosecutor said, I'll withdraw the question. So then she said, you said you wanted to kill Special Agent Scheider. And George said, yeah. She said, Jake did not. And George said, not to my knowledge. She asked, do you remember dyeing your hair the week of the homicides? George said no. Now, this is one of those things that, like, okay, so this is where she kind of caught him. It would have been way more powerful if she would have posted a picture on the big screen and said, hey, can you turn around and tell me, here's a picture of you in Alaska on your four-wheeler. Here's a picture of you a week after the murders. Tell me your hair's not darker. But no. So the prosecutor points out Chris and Randa are lying, and George said they're mistaken. They've accused me of dyeing my beard before, too. The prosecutor said, you remember Jake dyeing his hair? And George said, yeah. The prosecutor said, you remember your uncle making fun of the both of you? And George said, I remember he said that on the stand. The prosecutor asked if he had an endorsement on his driver's license for his motorcycle, and George said no. And then she asked if he owned one, and he said, well, he owned one, but it wasn't officially in his name. His dad, Billy, had given it to him. She asked if he had any photos of him on it, and he said, not here. So she asked, what is a Winter Soldier mask? And George said it's a Bucky Barnes mask, who is a lead character in a Marvel movie. And she said, Jake bought it for you? And he said, yes. So then she says, you said you knew your mom was monitoring Facebook for you. And George said, I never said for me. She was monitoring Tabby's Facebook. And the prosecutor asked about Tess's, and George said, I didn't know she was monitoring Tess's Facebook. So she said, Jake asked Hannah Mae to get any information she could regarding Tabby. And George said, I know Hannah Mae was doing that. Jake and Hannah Mae would tell him things they saw on her Facebook. The prosecutor said, and they were doing that so you could make sure she did not get custody of Vine. George said, I don't know why they were doing it. And he said he asked them to stop several times. I don't buy that one. The prosecutor said, really? You asked them to stop? And she said in a really sarcastic voice. George said, I wasn't worried about her getting full custody, but I didn't want Vine to have unsupervised visits until she straightened her life up. I didn't see any reason for the snooping on the Facebook. So the prosecutor says, you remember Angela telling Jake she was using her old Facebook and she needed Jake to get the password for that account. And she says, so your mom just guessed it? And George said, I don't know how she got it. I think maybe Angela Wagner on the stand, when she was talking about her little address book or book of passwords, I do think she did say that Tabby had her passwords in there at one point, if I'm not mistaken. I'll have to go back and look. But the prosecutor said the whole family was participating in the 1-year abandonment date. And George said, all I know is I didn't have to contact her. And he said he just assumed that she knew he was back in Ohio. And the prosecutor said, so what you're telling us is your mother and brother, to the extent that they even had Beth Ann use the Oak Hill address, just doing that on their own, you had no knowledge or desire for them to do that. And George said, I wasn't aware Beth used an Oak Hill address. The prosecutor said, you're not answering my question. But he kind of was, y'all. So you're telling us is your mother and brother, to the extent that they even had Beth Ann use the Oak Hill address, just doing that on their own. You have no knowledge or desire of them doing that. And George said, I wasn't aware Beth used an Oak Hill address. She said, you're not answering my question. That's just the little ways you see she was flustered. It was, I felt bad for her. The prosecutor said, isn't it true, everyone was trying to keep your address hidden? And George said, Mom and Jake did not want Agent Scheider to know they were back in Ohio. She said, you used the Oak Hill address yourself. And he said, for the purpose of R&L, that job, that trucking job, he said, I believe that was the reason I used it. So then she points out the fact that she said, you guys called the highway patrol and reported Tabby had drugs in her car. And there's an objection. And the defense attorney said this wasn't in the testimony. And prosecutor said, yes, it was. And then she asks again, another objection. And then the prosecutor says, oh my gosh. So it's sustained. And then she said, you and your mom called the highway patrol to say Tabby had drugs in her car. George said he did not know until Angela testified to that on the stand. And she said, oh, so until she walks in here. So again, she's just gratuitously doing things and you have no idea. George said, I didn't know she did that. So the prosecutor said, when Beth Ann is in your midst, and that's the first time you ever talk about this kind of stuff. And George said, what stuff? She said, protecting the children, their safety, protecting Vine from people like her family. And George said, I've talked about Tammy's mom and stepdad a lot. And the prosecutor said, and protecting Vine from Tabby. And George said, it wasn't particularly Tabby, but Tabby's stepdad and her family. The prosecutor said, and her sisters, who were also victims of child molestation. And George said, yeah, because to them, they said it was okay what happened to them. And if it happened to any child, they'll just get over it. The prosecutor said, what about this makes you think they are a threat to the safety of your child? And I mean, that alone, and George didn't answer the way I would have answered, but that question there with George's response to me didn't make sense because if you have people who think it's normal to have this happen to you, and if it happens to a kid, they'll just get over it. Well, that would make me think they're a threat to my safety. So George said because it happened to Tabby's mom and her sisters, and it was going from generation to generation. The prosecutor said, so you thought one of her sisters might molest your son? And George said, at one point, I thought it was possible. The prosecutor said, and your mom shared your concerns. And you also knew Hannah Mae had been raped and nobody did anything about it. And George said, I knew somebody did something to her, but he said he didn't know exactly what. She said, but you do know something was done and nobody did anything about it. And George said, yes. She said, oh Lord, y'all. We're just going to say she also was a threat, meaning Hannah Mae was also a threat. That kind of shocked me. And George said, no, Tabby believed it was right and that every kid goes through this. Hannah Mae did not believe that. The prosecutor said, so you talked to Hannah Mae about it? And George said, Hannah said, and then the prosecutor interrupts and said, my question is yes or no. And George says yes. So she said, your mom is also a victim. And George said, yeah, I didn't know it was a sexual assault until this began. He said he knew something happened to her, but he didn't know what. She said, you now know. And George said, yes. And she said, she also did not do anything about it. And George said, from my understanding, no. The prosecutor said, you and Angela always sided with Jake, except when it came to Beth Ann. George said, I believe that was the first time she ever sided with me. The prosecutor said, and she sided with you against Jake because Jake was very much wanted to continue his relationship and his marriage, but you and your mom weren't having it. And George said, I didn't want her living at the house. The prosecutor said, so you wanted him to conduct his marriage, not living in the same house. And George said, that's not what I said. I mean, I'm kicking him out too. And the prosecutor said, and you were going to keep Sophia with you? And George said, I didn't feel Sophia was safe around Beth. Jake wasn't protecting her. So she said, at that time, even Jake was a threat to the safety of Sophia in your eyes. And George said, I felt he wasn't paying attention to her or putting her first. The prosecutor said, you were critical of Jake with Beth. One thing was when Jake would come home from work, he didn't hug Sophia first. And George said, yeah, and a couple of times she would bump into Sophia to get her out of the way to get to him first. And the prosecutor said, like knocking her to the ground. And George said, yes. The prosecutor said, I think you said yesterday Jake didn't hug anyone but Sophia, but now you're saying he hugged Beth. You know, y'all, he's married to her. They're doing what married people do. I don't think a hug is out of the question. And George said, when we first moved to Peterson, no. When we left Peterson, it was different. He was married. So prosecutor said, you heard him say he wanted to hug you, your mom, and your dad before he went to prison. And George said it was shocking because he doesn't like to be touched. She said, do you remember talking to your mom about Randa getting into various Facebook groups? And George said, I believe it was topics. It could have been Facebook. The prosecutor said, you told your mom that Randa got into one of those groups and she didn't see anything that looked important, but if she wanted to, she could scan through it the next time she saw her. George said, I was kind of a relayer between them. And Randa said she could look through when she next saw her. The prosecutor said, so you were aware of that Facebook monitoring? And George shot back real quick. He said it wasn't a Facebook account. It was a group she got into. The prosecutor said, "You saw the thousands of screenshots your mom took and printed out." And George said, haven't seen more than a few. I told her she didn't have a reason to monitor Tabby's page after we weren't going to fix things." The prosecutor said, in March of 15, she said she wanted to get more visitation. She tried to say she had more rights. And George said she tried to say she had more rights than she did. The prosecutor says, right. And that was concerning to you? And George said, no, because I informed her she doesn't have those rights, Divine. The prosecutor says, so your mom and Jake were lying when they said they shared things with you they got from that Facebook. Specifically, when Hannah Mae was telling Tess they'll have to kill me first. And George said he never saw that message. Prosecutor said, you've never seen it? And you said you didn't know Jake was recording when he was picking up Sophia. And you said Jake insulted people about the state of their homes, and you knew he was going to an attorney about the custody. George said, I knew he went to get his 7 days on, 7 days off on paper. And the prosecutor says, right. You also knew there were concerns about Sophia when she came back. And in particular, and we heard this in the courtroom, you said, why are you so filthy? They don't know how to give you a bath, put clothes on you. And George said, I've told her that many times. He said, I used to pick on her, not just with when she came back from the rodents, but with Jake. He said, I used to call Sophia dirty butt all the time, and she would get a kick out of it. She said, I don't recall her laughing on this occasion. Do you recall her laughing? And George said, I don't remember. And the prosecutor said, yeah. So you weren't doing that for the benefit of the recording. And George said, I didn't know he was recording. So then she said, and then you were there another time with them, and you say, can we get out of here before Chris and little Chris and all them get up here? No, don't go past Chris's. And Jake asked which way to go. And George said, that way. George said, I don't remember that conversation. The prosecutor said it was played for you in the court. And George said, I don't remember. I don't know when it took place. She said, okay, so you remember hearing it. Any reason in February of 2016 you wanted to get out of here before all of them get here? And George said, I don't know why I would have been in a hurry. I don't remember the context. He didn't remember why he said it. So yeah, he has a lot of selective memory on. That's not lost on me. Don't get me wrong. The prosecutor said, you remember looking through the books at the tattoo shop? And George said, vaguely. She said, you didn't arrive with a piece of paper of what you wanted. And George said, no. She said, you were together in June of 2016 in that shop with Billy. And George said, yeah, but I don't remember anyone but me getting a tattoo that way. And she said, or that day, she said, you're getting a Cummings diesel tattoo covered up. You're a hunting and diesel fanatic, not a gambling fanatic. And George said, not a fanatic, but I bet on everything. And she's like what? And he's like, oh, he kind of grins and says anything and everything, cards, shooting pool, dice, horses, if it's going to snow today. The prosecutor said, but you didn't shoot pool or anything. And he said, she said, why not get a better Cummings tattoo? And Jake had added on to his, and he had flames coming out and George said, he wanted a cover up, not to add to it. He said, I assumed I could get anything put on me, but he said, I wanted the Cummings C off of me. She says, right. And you approved the skull and 8-ball. George said he drew it and I approved. The prosecutor said you wouldn't have approved if it was unicorns. And George said, probably not. And she says, probably not. When looking at the books, the skull was the first thing you wanted. And George said he picked the 8-ball. I didn't say I wanted the skull. I approved it when he was done. The prosecutor said, you have to help me. How does a skull and an 8-ball go together? George said, it's the whole gambling theme. They mostly have the skull, the dice, the pool ball, anything like that. And she says, okay. Why 3 aces instead of 4? And George said, I don't know. Sean picked that. So I have a friend who's a tattoo artist, and I asked about the skull and the 8-ball and the dead man's hand and all that. And guys, I'm not stupid. Like, it is the worst tattoo he ever could have got, whether it was intentional or not. He knows. But I did call today after this testimony and ask just to see for myself, like, does the gambling tattoos have a lot of skulls and 8-balls and dice? And he said, yeah, they do. I do think it had more meaning than just, I'm going to let some dude draw something random on me. But then again, he opted out when he testified. I need to go back to my notes to see what exactly he said. I'm going to do that tomorrow and see what his version of it was. The surveillance system that they bought in March, Jake's card was used. You said your grandpa got robbed, so you took that system down to him, and George said, "My mom wanted us to." She said, "Sure. Is there any reason you didn't buy another one? I mean, you're leaving your mom home alone with your kids." And George said, "I've never preferred a security system." She said, "But you've had one everywhere you lived." And George said, "Yeah, my mom did." And she said, "Bethel Hill?" He said, "Yeah." She said, "You lived there. This was your house. It was in your name and your brother's name." And George said, "It was not my security system. It was my mother's." She said, "You and your brother bought it?" And George said, "Yes, for my mother." She said, "For your mother, for the protection of your house, your property, and all the people in it." And George said, "I can't say why she wanted it, but that's probably as good of a reason as any." She said, "And then your grandfather gets robbed, your grandfather who deals drugs." She's really kind of poking the bear. She's really trying to elicit some kind of an outburst or a response. It's not working. And George said, "Yeah." And she said, "You take the surveillance system to him without buying him one or replacing yours. But the system ends up in the burn pile at Peterson." She said, "All kinds of mysteries," which I thought was pretty funny. And George said, "The last time I saw it, it was on his house." She said, "Speaking of your grandfather, you said yesterday you would have never went to Alaska. You never would have went. However, when you came back from the first trip, you indicated to agents at the border you might not go back because both of your grandfathers were in very poor health." And George said, "Correct, but I didn't think they were at death's door." She said, "That's odd because you told the agents your dad's dad had 3 months to live, and this grandfather on your mom's side, this hero, this mentor, had a year because he was paralyzed from the waist down. Had a year to live, by the way, because he was paralyzed from the waist down since he was 17. He had a hole in his spine, an infection got in. The person you loved so much had been given 1 year to live because he was rotting out and there was no fixing it." And George said, "I didn't say there was no fixing it. My grandpa told me before I left that he was perfectly fine." I'm gonna tell you right now, man, my grandpa was my best friend, okay? If I had done nothing wrong, man, dude, I think if George was going to cave at any point today, it would have been with this, really. There are ways you can poke the bear that I'm sure are easy for him to overlook because his life's on the line. I mean, he is fighting for his life right now. He's on the stand trying to get out of jail, to be found innocent, to whatever. If the deal falls through with Jake and Angela, maybe spare his life. But when you start poking around about a grandpa who's passed away and you say he's rotting out and this hero, this mentor, I get her point that they didn't come back for the funerals. But I was waiting on George to kind of explode. He did not. He did have some very subtle facial expressions, but she said again in May of 2017, you told BCI he was given 1 year to live and you did not know if you were going back. You would have to discuss going back to Alaska with your family. And George said, "I don't remember saying that. It's possible I said that." She said, "Was that a lie?" And George said, I don't remember if I said it." She said, "Perfectly fine, but you went anyway and he died. And you didn't come back for his funeral or your other grandfather's funeral." George said, "I was advised not to come back." She said, "You were advised not to come back for the funeral of this man who you love so much. I thought you," she said, "I thought you did what you wanted. Isn't that what you've told us?" And George said, "Yes." This is good by Angel or Prosecutor Canepa. She said, "So you're going to let someone tell you not to come back for your grandfather's funeral? And why was it you shouldn't come back?" And George said that his attorney said BCI might plant stuff in their luggage at the airport and stuff. And prosecutor said, "You were raised to find a way around that." And George said, "You can't get around anything in an airport." It's true, y'all. The prosecutor said, "So they plant something in your luggage. What are you worried about? You didn't do anything." And George said, "That's what I mean is they plant stuff." And she said, "Oh, you mean like drugs or something?" And George said, "Yeah." She said, "Do you remember telling us yesterday that your dad was a sidekick of Chris Sr.'s regarding the drugs? And then do you remember telling agents at the border you knew nothing of it?" And George said, "Yes, I do remember that." She said, "Oh, so you did lie at the border?" And George said, "Yeah, that's the only lie I told at the border." This was a reach to me with George. I mean, come on. We know they had an alibi that they had all agreed to that night. And, now he's testifying. He went to bed at 10 o'clock. And so, um, but after George said, "That's the only lie I told at the border," she laughs kind of low and says, "Okay. You said your dad was all the way against drugs, so why lie? And he said, everyone on topics and Facebook were running the rodents in the ground. And she said, oh, this is good. So you were doing this to protect the reputation of Hannah Mae and her family. But you also said your dad had nothing to do with drugs and that he had nothing to do with Hannah Mae. He said nothing to do with drugs. And the drugs has nothing really to do with Hannah Mae. I think that had nothing to do with Hannah Mae, does it? George said when he was doing it with Chris, yes, it had something to do with Hannah Mae. She said, but he was doing drugs too, talking about Billy. And George said, there's a difference in doing drugs and selling drugs. And she said, but you said he was all the way against doing drugs. I'm telling you right now, that's what you said. My dad is all the way against drugs. Another thing you said, if there was drugs and we know about it, why didn't we just snitch to get custody? George said, I don't remember saying that. And she said, interesting, because that's what your mom testified to, that was the very first idea that she had. And George said, I don't remember saying that. She said, would a transcript refresh your recollection? And George said, if it's on paper, I probably said it. I don't remember saying it. She said, you were asked yesterday why you didn't say anything about being interrogated for 4 hours when you got in the car. You were shown a bloody shoe print and ballistics. And George said, yeah, I thought the ballistics evidence was BS. She said, of course you did. So you get out there. You never said, what the heck? They think you did this. They think we did that. They think, this happened, that happened. And George said, I was worried because my son said his mom was there. And he said he was also worried about Vine. The prosecutor said, you had an hour without Jake there and you didn't say a word about what had just happened. George said, I don't know what was said. And the prosecutor said, you got the discovery. And George said, I haven't been through most of the discovery. The prosecutor kind of laughs and says, okay. She says, you said yesterday you were worried about Vine being medicated. You took him to the ER. That information didn't come until Sophia came to the car. You assumed Jake would come to the car. And George said, yeah, I thought you guys were framing us. Prosecutor says, sure. You didn't ask your mom about the shoes? And he said, I don't remember talking to her about it. And she said, right, sure. You didn't say anything about the ballistics. You had just been shown. And George said, I remember talking about the ballistics. She said, you had been told your mom had admitted to buying those shoes. And George said, I didn't believe she admitted to buying the shoes. So see, like I would have laid in and been like, okay, so you were shown a receipt and you did not say, Mom, what are these shoes about? That was a chance to go in and kind of, because that relates to the murders. So she says, how many times have you been stopped by border agents investigating the murders of 8 people you know? Great question, by the way. He said, once. She said, you told Chris Newcomb not to talk to BCI, and he said multiple times. She said, you knew he told BCI you were a Glock guy and you had bought a 40 caliber Glock. And George said, I knew he said that, but he got the caliber wrong. I didn't know at the time that a Glock was used in the murders. And she said, but you told him not to talk to BCIs. And he said, yes, I didn't want him to be dragged into this. And he said he also told Randall once or twice not to talk to BCI. She said, who else? He said, that's all I can think of. She said, Uncle Danny? He said, maybe Uncle Danny. I don't remember. Rita? Don't remember if I told her that or not. Then they move on to the family emergency that developed the day after Agent Scheider sent the photo of Jake holding that 1911 gun. The gun bought the same day you bought your dad a gun. You are heard on that call. And George said, yeah, it happened a couple of times. And she said, related to the investigation. And he talks about a couple of times, apparently they put in for an emergency, a family emergency, and got off a couple of times, and it related to the investigation. Okay, y'all. Being 45, let me just tell you, you see this glistening? Mama's having a heat flash. Whoo, Lord. If I was not on this, I would go stand outside because it is cold as Alaska out there. So the prosecutor said, so it's the day you texted that photo. You're texted that photo. And he said, yeah, Jake said it wasn't his, and he wanted to get back to talk to Clark, the attorney, to get BCI to stop badgering us. And she said, that's interesting. When the company said the other driver would be on the road, and Jake said, that's the thing, he's my brother. George said, I don't know why he put my name into it, but we both had to come home anyway. He said, otherwise, I would have had no ride home from Texas. She said, right. But you acknowledge you guys called in a family emergency and came home sooner than you would have when Agent Scheider texted you. And George said it was actually about 10 hours early. They just didn't make that stop to drop off a load. She said, "What's wrong with your brother's eyesight?" And George said he didn't know the medical term for it, but he was having issues with his pupils deteriorating. Yesterday, he said his retina. And she said, and that's why he couldn't see at night. And George said he couldn't see good, and I didn't trust him to drive at night. She said, "Your dad broke his back hauling cattle." And George said he claims he did. She said he was by himself and says he got pushed up against the wall of the trailer. And George said that's what he says. But he said he was still walking around. And she said this was before you bought Bernie's trailer, which is when they started Wagner trucking hauling the cows. She said, "You fought your dad in early 2016, and that would have been after." And George said, "Yes." She said, "Do you remember telling the border agent your dad was a big teddy bear and you never saw him violent?" And George said, "I excluded myself. I said I'd never seen him that way with others." And she said, "Sure. Do you remember telling agents that you and Jake were the only ones who had good credit?" And he said, "Yes." She said, "You said yesterday that your mom would use your credit card and never tell you." And George said she had the right to. She said, "You paid attention to your balance." And George said, "I never looked at the statements." I don't either, y'all. I got auto draft. Like, I probably should, but I don't look at my credit card statements. Like, I don't really put a lot on them anyway. I try to pay cash for everything, but I can tell you the last time I went through my credit card statements. She said, "You never paid attention to what was being purchased." And he said, "No." She said, "Do you remember your mom being defensive, saying it would be snooping if she looked at your statements?" And he said, "No." She said, "Talk to me about your family meetings." And he said, "You can call them that if you want. It was mainly who was going to pay what bill." She said, "So you do pay attention to bills?" And George said, "No. Mom would say, this is what's owed on this or what's owed on that. And I would bring her the cash for my half and she would pay it." She said, "Everyone who testified said you have family meetings and they've been there when they happen." Objection. And so this is defense attorney Nash. He throws it kind of back on what she did yesterday when defense attorney Parker was on direct. He says, defense attorney Nash says, "Is she asking questions or testifying?" And she said, "It's a question." And he said, "You need to get quicker. You're testifying." So she said, were you present when multiple people testified from that chair you're in and said you have family meetings?" And she said, "You also heard your mom on the call saying that when you get home, we will have a family meeting." And George said, "I remember hearing that. I don't remember what it was about, though." She said, "You said what it's about." And she said, "All this." And you said, "They ain't going to do crap." Now, what do you think that's about? Bills? He said, "Probably not." She said, "Why is it not important for you to have us not think you don't have family meetings?" And George said, "It's not really important. I just don't call them a family meeting." She said, "Obviously, your mom does." And George said, "I can't help what she calls it." He said, "I don't call it that. If we talk about family vacations, do we call this a family meeting?" He said, "I don't see it as a boardroom meeting." She said, "What about the move to Missouri?" George said, "I was going anyway. I didn't have a job, and the job in Missouri ultimately wasn't what I thought it was. That job that I wanted was in Ohio." She said, "And you missed your family, I think you said." And "George said, I miss Chris. Yeah." She said, "A few months later, you're talking about wanting to move back out west somewhere." And George said, "Yes, because of everything being said on topics and Facebook." She said, "And how did you know what was being said?" He said, "My mom and brother would monitor it daily and wouldn't stop going on about what was being said." And she said, "Oh, so they told you about those things?" And George said, "Not really. I did overhear them in the truck when they were talking." So the prosecutor said, "You had a few spats with your folks and you thought you would leave. You drove to Kentucky and came back. And after you were married," George said, "a couple of times actually with Tabby." She said, "You had all that money in the safe. Why not go?" And George said, "After we split up is when I had all the money, not when we were married." So they talk about the bug detector. You said your dad had one and two GPS trackers. And George said he actually bought them for Chris Sr. And she said, "When?" And he said, "In early 2015, they used them together." She said, "How do you know that?" George said, "My dad told me." She said, "You've heard the conversation you had with your mom when you get home, you're going to buy a bug detector. You said we had a detector that picked up video cameras, bunch of bull crap. I had a bug detector. Remember on the phone, that's what he said." To Angela, "You said it picked up frickin' listening devices, tracking devices, anything like that was a listening device." You said you had a bug detector, and George said, I played with the one that Chris Sr. and my dad had for a couple of weeks. She said, why did you need another one? Pretty big purchase on your credit card. And George said, I did not know that was on there. For someone who makes the majority of the decisions in your house, you didn't know a lot. And George said, if you want to look at it that way, you can look at it that way. I didn't know it was on there. And she said, you remember indicating out of the four, your mom should get the best attorney so she could take care of the kids. George said, yes. She was with them 5 days a week and they were used to her. She said, just like if you guys got killed or caught the night of the murder, they would go to her. And George said, not for that. I wasn't there or involved that night. She said, okay. Who was involved? George said, at this point, I only know of my mom and brother. She said, can you see any situation where Jake would have done this alone? George said, I don't know. I didn't think he was capable of this. And she said, no getaway driver, no one to shoot from the outside. And George said, I don't know. I can't answer that. She said, do you remember telling Jake the family has spoken regarding Beth? And he said, yes, that Beth Ann couldn't live there anymore. He said, mom didn't want her in the complex, right? Or she said, the prosecutor said, mom didn't want her in the complex, right? And George said, yeah. So all this time you say that, now she kind of gets a little flustered here. So all this time that you say that today, and then she laughs, say you could barely stand your family. You actually very much were together with them. You moved to Alaska, you moved to Missouri. And George said, yeah. She said, you told your brother you would go to he would go to BCI and rat you guys out because he's the biggest rat there is. And George said, yeah, I said that. She said, do you remember telling your mom, I'm sorry, and you're going to hate when I say this, everything you and dad have ever gotten in trouble for with them mother frickers. And the only reason they ever got away with that crap was because every time somebody caved and everybody crumbled. Do you remember saying that? And George said, I remember the conversation. She said, is that your philosophy? You don't cave and crumble? And George says, I don't believe you should plead out to something you didn't do. And she said, sure. But they did do the things they pled to. In fact, they did way more things than they ever pled to. She is referring back to Billy and Angela when they were stealing stuff. George said, I think it was a receiving charge in the beginning. The first charge was my father. I think it was receiving or theft. She said, and your dad committed that offense. And George said, he actually didn't do the first one. And she said, which one was that? And he said, the first one was for motorcycles or something like that. At least that's his memory of it. And she said, yeah, there's no conviction for that. There's an objection. And the judge said to disregard the prosecutor's comment. So George admits that Angela was guilty of shoplifting at places like Walmart, and Billy was the one who stole the Rocky boots. She said that's the only charges they had. George said, I was under the assumption there were more, but that was from his dad's recollection. So at this point, you think she's kind of done. So she's conferring with the other prosecutors. And she comes back and she says, what is a jumping title? George said, can you say that again? And she said, a jumping title. And he said, my words may be different with yours, but if I buy a vehicle and I don't put it in my name and sell it to someone else, that's my understanding of it. She said, kind of like what happened with the vehicles for the murder. And George said, I knew he was buying a truck. I didn't know what it was for. The prosecutor said, you didn't want it to buy that. Prosecutor said, you didn't want him to buy that from him because he was buying it from a relative and intending to use it for the murders. I believe that's what Jake testified to, by the way. George said, no. She said, and now you say Chris Sr. was involved in that. And George said, Chris just brought him that one morning to drop him off so he could get the truck. She said, and you heard your cousin Katie testify that morning of the murders, your dad showed up with the truck for the first time. You think she's not telling the truth? And George said, I assume he gave it to her. I just didn't know when. She said, you said he spent the night at your house. And George said he did, but I don't know when he left. I didn't see him come back either. She said, your statement at the border was you all got up and you and Jake left. And George said, we went to tear the building down. She said, you didn't tell the agents he left that morning. And George said, I don't know when he left. She said, you recall being asked at the border what trucks you had at the time of the homicides. He said he doesn't really remember what all they asked about that. You didn't tell them about the truck used in the homicides. And George said, I didn't know what they asked me. So they go through a list. He names off all these trucks, confirms which one they had, which one they didn't. She asked if you didn't talk about any other vehicles. And George said, am I referring to when I got searched in 2016? And George said everyone had more vehicles than that, but he listed the daily drivers they had. The prosecutor said, "You didn't mention the one your dad bought from Uncle Toddy." And George said, "No, I didn't." And she said, "You were worried about your mom taking custody of Vine?" George said, "When we were back on South Webster." The prosecutor said, "But in 2016, you just signed that piece of paper without ever looking at it." And George said she had never threatened to take him from me at that point. She said, "You said you would get her the best attorney so she could get the kids." And George said, "Yeah." And there was another custody document in between those. And she says, "Okay, that's it. She's done." Redirect Parker says, "It's been a long couple of days for you." And George said, "Fairly." So he asked, "Did you see Jake buy the 1911? No. Did you know he had one? No. Did you go on Union Hill Road and participate in these murders? No. Did you plan these murders? No. Did you know they were going to happen? No. Did you know afterwards your family was involved? Not until my brother's proffer. Did you go to Left Fork Road? No. Have you been paid for your testimony? No. Have you been given anything? No. Did the state offer you a plea bargain for your testimony? No. Are you telling the truth? Yes. Your life is on the line? Yes. Are you telling the truth as you answer to God? Yes. Thank you, Judge. No other questions. Recross. What happens to you if you come in here and you admit you went with your brother and father and went to Union Hill Road and Left Fork Road and slaughtered perfectly innocent people who lay asleep in their beds, two of them babies in their bed with their mothers? From all testimony, were actively nursing their infants. What happens to you if you come in here on the stand and admit to that? And George said, "Do you want me to answer what I feel should happen to anyone who would do that?" She said, "I want to know what happens to you if you come in here and admit it." And George said, "What should happen to anybody is they should have death given to them." Canepa is shook, y'all. It was quiet, long pause. I don't think she was expecting that answer. I think she was expecting him to say, "I didn't do it." He said, "I think they should have death given to them." And so the prosecutor said, "The biggest difference between you and your brother is when he does wrong, he tells about it." George said, "Yeah, when we were kids." And that was it, y'all. Um, Look, Canepa did bring up some points that were valid, that were discrepancies where clearly he's lying, but y'all, it just wasn't anything having to do with the murder of the Rodens or Hannah Hazel. And look, I hope the jury takes their time and makes the right decision. I I think we all doubt he was oblivious, like I said at the beginning of the episode, but um, man, this was an opportunity for the prosecution to really nail him to the wall, and it didn't happen. The comments I've read have I've been actually reading a couple as I'm doing this just to see kind of currently what people are saying. It is very divided, y'all. Take some time if you haven't to go through YouTube, the YouTube comments on my channel or Facebook groups. Um, I mean, just it's interesting. Twitter, there's a lot of divided people, y'all. I'm curious to know what you guys think. So let me know in the comments what you think about today's testimony, cross exam, redirect, all that. I thought it really ended on a powerful note for George, and I also thought that the prosecutor's very last statement was well thought out. The biggest difference between you and your brother is when he does wrong, he tells about it. I thought that was good. I thought that was a good point. But if you guys saw a big aha moment, let me know. Beyond a reasonable doubt, let me know what you think. I'm curious. I really am. It's a good conversation. I don't take offense if people have a different opinion than me. It's just a big world, and it would be pretty darn boring if we all agreed and had the same opinion on everything. So, tomorrow, I will correct myself if I'm wrong. I do believe the jury is not coming in until 1 p.m. Now, Agent Scheider did take the stand after George was done. It wasn't super long from what I understand. He may be on a good bit for the next few days for kind of a rebuttal. So we'll see. I will double check that, see who else might be coming on. I was curious if maybe she would recall Jake and Angela. They cannot say no if she does. It might be a powerful thing to do, I think, given how today went, is maybe bring them back up and drive home the fact that your brother and your mother are on the stand throwing you under the bus, whether they're being honest or not. That's for the jury to decide, really, not us. But anyway, so let me know what you think. And so I'm taking my grandmother early in the morning, y'all, early, 7 o'clock. And I'm glad to get her epidural for her chronic back pain she's had since August. So works out good that there's no testimony, I think, until 1. If there is, I'll put it on social media. I'm going to have my store back up and running tomorrow. I've got a few Christmas designs. I'm redoing some things. I did not like the way some quotes just look like a square. So I've incorporated a little bit of style to it. I'm excited, y'all. I've ordered me a few samples. And then, just take a look. If you don't like it, let me know. If you see something that you want done differently, let me know. It's really, really easy for me to do. If there's something that you don't see that you want, let me know. This is like totally up to you guys. And anyway, so y'all have a good night. We'll see you tomorrow at some point. I will finish up Scheider today and whatever he testifies to tomorrow. And then we are going to enjoy the weekend, y'all. All right. Have a good one.